Hi, I'm Joshua Corman. Thank you for letting me kick off this great lineup of very strong and diverse speakers on some increasingly important topics. I'm going to start with why. We'll talk about trust, transparency, our dependence, increasing dependence on digital infrastructure, and your role in this increasing dependence. So, First, I Am the Cavalry is not my day job, but it's a passion. And we're 1,000 or more volunteer hackers and a coalition of willing trying to save lives through security research. Yes, I said hackers. You can tell because I'm wearing a hoodie. Hackers come in all shapes and sizes. But the idea here is we want to focus wherever bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. And it's a kind of a logical extension of the rugged software movement, if you're familiar with that, which became rugged DevOps. And then DevSecOps, but the public safety, human life aspect really focused on this I Am the Cavalry movement in recognition that the cavalry isn't coming. No one's going to save us and fix this for us. And if something's missing, we got to put it in the world. So these helpful hackers, we're not all motivated the same way in the lawful hacker community. There's protectors that want to make the world safer, puzzlers, prestige, profit, protest. The cavalry really attracted the protectors and the puzzlers that want to make the world a safer place. And we wrote primitives, right? We tried to start small, create a common denominator of things that every policymaker domestically and internationally, and every device maker and every safety critical systems designer could think through. And we basically said all systems fail. You should be able to handle failure across 5 things. How do you avoid failure? How do you take help avoiding failure without suing the helpers? Capture, study, and learn from failure, contain and isolate failure or fail safely, and then respond against future failure. And sometimes this would be the Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices. Doctors take a symbolic oath to do no harm. And increasingly, as technology plays a role in the delivery of that patient care, we felt that these technologies should preserve and support that intent. So let's go through really fast. We're going to talk about some context and inflection points about dependence, some warnings and warning signs, how the pandemic made things a lot worse. I should disclose, I've recently ended an 18-month run of emergency public service and CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where I was hired by then Director Krebs to design and develop what became the CISA COVID Task Force, a massively multidisciplinary intersectional risk group to identify and buy down risk against weaknesses in hospitals and healthcare delivery, but also the vaccine supply chains, and then eventually the stresses and strains on our nation's critical infrastructure as part of CISA's enduring mission. And boy, did the pandemic reveal some of these overdependence on undependable things. And then let's talk about what this community has to do about it. So some of that context, many of you may remember almost out of evolutionary necessity, Bill Gates wrote that Trustworthy computing memo in 2002 in recognition that if they didn't take this more seriously, they were going to lose their lunch to Unix and Linux and Macintosh and the like. But where is that zeitgeist and attitude that if you have a choice between a new feature or fixing a security issue, you go fix a security issue? They did it for selfish reasons, but it did pioneer a lot of great work. But what I like about it is it was a pathos, or it was really an ethic, kind of like a Hippocratic Oath. But where is our pathos for software engineering? Some of you have heard me say this before, but one of the closest proxies is move fast and break things. Well, that may include breaking democracy or social cohesion. It could be Reid Hoffman. If you're not embarrassed by your code, the first version of your product, you've launched it too late. Now, imagine if we said move fast and break things, or being not embarrassed by the first set of riveting you did, then you should be ashamed of yourself. Like, imagine if we built bridges this way or skyscrapers this way. We should not do minimum viable protection for digital critical infrastructure. These things bear too much responsibility and too much weight. So we don't want to have indefensible, unreliable infrastructure, and software isn't so soft, right? So a long time ago, I can't even remember how many years ago now, I read the Agile Manifesto, which is now over 20 years old, 2001. So when someone says they're heading towards an agile process, they're wrong. 20-year response time isn't exactly what I would call quick. Hopefully they can leapfrog to continuous everything. But in this Rugged Software Manifesto, we tried to initially have a response that was more conscious of the awesome responsibility that comes with writing digital infrastructure. And more recently, one of my co-authors of that, David Rice, he wrote a book called Geekonomics. The one line he wishes he put into his book, and I included it in my RSA talk from last COVID RSA, is that we sometimes feel like we're art and we sometimes feel like we're engineering. And it's really both. It's art, but with engineering consequences. What a great line. So the closest thing I've tried to steer people towards through my I Am the Cavalry movement is when I do testimonies or participate in a commission, you'll often see a line that resembles this one. It's through our over dependence on undependable IT. We have created the conditions such that the actions of any single outlier, any accident or adversary can have a profound and asymmetric impact on human life, economic, and national security. And really, this is me channeling my inner Dan Gear about dependence and dependability and ratios and proportionality. And perhaps you'll see some similar language show up in the executive orders later on. But when we founded I Am the Cavalry, a law professor and rheumatician who goes to all the DEF CONs and whatnot, and one of the more hacker literate policymakers, she said, Josh, everyone's waiting for the first death and no one's going to listen until people die. But you're going to have to set your expectations. It's going to be less about a cyber Pearl Harbor or a cyber 9/11. It's going to be more like this cyber Cuyahoga River. So this is the site of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. This is a burning river, a river on fire. How does one extinguish a river on fire? Well, the pollution had gotten so bad in this location, which is about where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame sits today, where the factories along the rivers had property damage, burned down bridges, burned down factory shorelines. And this wasn't the first time the river burned. She had told us at the time it burned 2 or 3 times before this photo was snapped, and it triggered enough catalytic peer pressure and public pressure that eventually the Clean Water Act passed and then became the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency. But upon reading into the history more, this river caught on fire not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 21 times across a 70-year period. So it was not just a fire, but a series of fires where we say enough is enough and finally get political will to do something. Well, let's zoom out. Not all of these are particularly software hacking flaws, right? Some of them are just really insecure exposures. But let's think of the lifeline critical infrastructure that makes society work. We have had successful compromise of the water we drink more than once this year through remote hacking. I'd call that a river on fire. We have had successful compromise of food supply, the food we put on our table more than one time. I'd call that a river on fire. We have had successful compromise of the oil and gas that fuels our cars, our home, and our mass transit. I'd call that a river on fire. We have had successful compromises of the schools our children go to, of the municipalities who run our towns and our cities, of the federal agencies charged with our secrets and our protection of national security issues. I would call these rivers on fire. Stuff's on fire, folks. So did we have warnings? Did we have warning signs? I'm going to take a much more healthcare specific bent coming off of 18 months of trying to keep the country safe during a once in a 100-year pandemic. So before the pandemic, I got very nervous one day when Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital in Los Angeles got hit by the Sam ransomware. It was a single flaw in a single Java library, a deserialization flaw for this crowd in a single Java library, in a single JBoss, in a single medical technology in that hospital was enough to take out operations for the better part of a week. Ambulances were diverted up the street in LA traffic. I don't know if you've ever been in LA traffic, but if you're bleeding and you need timely medical care, you do not want to go even a block or 2 away, let alone further away, where minutes or hours may be the difference between if you walk again or talk again. And then shortly thereafter, as we're reeling from that, where I said, geez, if we had a software bill of materials, we could at least know, am I affected and where am I affected? Because Hollywood Presbyterian was warned, along with other hospitals, they weren't specifically being targeted, but anyone using that vulnerable version of JBoss might get hacked. But they couldn't tell what a JBoss was. And out of thousands and thousands of pieces of equipment, am I affected and where am I affected? Could have been done in minutes or hours instead of days or weeks. In fact, they didn't find it in time and got hit. After that attack, hospitals became the number one target of ransomware worldwide. Okay, so as we're reeling from that, we had a tsunami of IoT technical debt. The Mirai botnet took advantage of low hygiene, cheap IoT devices. It was hard-coded passwords that were, you couldn't update the devices, $110 cameras across the world, large enough botnet that Akamai and the DNS infrastructure couldn't handle it at Dyn. And it took the internet offline for half a day or so right before the presidential election in 2016, which made Senator Warner at the time say, wait a second, I thought you all said if we regulate IoT, it might stifle innovation or hurt the economy. It looks to me like if we don't have some minimum hygiene standards, perhaps we're going to hurt the economy and stifle creativity. So around the time of this, I got pulled into a healthcare industry cybersecurity task force for Congress. We're not going to go through all those things. Many of you have seen it before, but just to remind you that there were seams and cracks in our healthcare IT before the pandemic. Most notably is that 85% was our estimate, but 85% of hospitals in the country lack a single security person on staff, often depending really old stuff that's way over connected, tons of vulnerabilities that affect not just your privacy, but your patient care. I love my privacy. I'd like to be alive to enjoy it. And known vulnerabilities are everywhere. We just do not care about the software hygiene. And one device that Billy Rios looked at had over 1,400 CVEs in it. And while most were not exploitable, it only takes one, as we've come to learn all too often. So which we said, if you can't afford to protect these networks, then you can't afford to connect them. They didn't like that. So I used my inner Stan Lee instead and said, with great connectivity comes great responsibility. And as we're reeling from this and publishing this, WannaCry manifested our worst nightmare. 30% or more of the UK health service, National Health Service, was affected by a piece of ransomware that wasn't even very well written, but was damaging enough to have massive delayed integrated patient care for the better part of Mother's Day weekend. The US got quite lucky. And as we discussed getting lucky, NotPetya, a different attack aimed at the Ukraine and Ukrainian businesses, escaped its blast radius and did significant damage across the world, including over $1 billion of damage to Merck Pharmaceutical. It's disrupting 20 to 30% of global shipping through Maersk, and even had quite a bit of impact on, if you read the book later written about this by the same author, the Wired piece, it disrupted hospitals quite a bit. Nuance software in their cloud backup for voice to text dictation dramatically degraded and delayed patient care, including access to a record for 2 children who needed time-sensitive surgery but couldn't get cleared for surgery because of these IT entanglement failures in healthcare. So why does this matter? Well, it's not just about our privacy. I love my privacy. I'd like to be alive to enjoy it. But what we know from other areas of medical publications is that delays affect mortality rates. And cybersecurity can affect delays, which affect mortality rates. So this New England Journal of Medicine article showed that if you have a heart attack during a US marathon, the 4.4 minute longer ambulance ride had a statistically significant elevated mortality rate after 30 days. So 4.4 minutes is enough to be the difference between life and death for a heart attack. So in the CyberMed Summit, what we realized is we took the cavalry, partnered with 2 physicians and said, well, if no one's going to listen until people die, let's do what any good self-respecting hackers would do. Let's kill people. So we did. We killed a lot of people in ER hacking simulations. We took, much like a flight simulator, physicians practice with actors and surgical dummies, very rare conditions to keep their skills sharp. And we took those blind simulations and combined actual hacking with actual human physiology to see how the doctors could adapt. We hacked an insulin pump like Jay Radcliffe has done for his own, where he emptied a lethal dose of insulin that caused a car crash to see if they'd even notice and treat the right things. We took Billy Rios's famous hack that led to the first ever safety communication or recall for a medical device in FDA history, purely for cyber reasons, for an unmitigated pathway to harm. This was a bedside infusion pump, and we emptied a 3-hour dose of a calcium blocker in 30 seconds, causing a heart attack. Third, and most dramatically, we hacked a subdural pacemaker defibrillator and gave an electroshock every minute on the minute, causing pain and disorientation for the victim, but also confounding the doctors, and none of their normal software controlled safety backups worked. So it would both cause heart attacks and sometimes revitalize the guy until ultimately they cracked the chest and removed it for not knowing what to do. So these were filmed on ABC Nightline. You can watch some of that if you like on a piece called Fear of Hackers, but it was artfully done. And we've gone on to do many more of these. And now its new home is not their alma mater in Phoenix, but rather now at UCSD. And we do tabletop crisis simulations as well to give people a visceral feel for that overdependence on undependable IT. In subsequent sessions, we've now hacked blood type for an OR, not just in the ER, to see if people would notice and be able to save the patient when time matters. And we've even realized you can lead to a loss of life without touching the patient at all. Simply locking up their MRIs and imaging systems prevented timely diagnosis of which kind of a stroke patient was happening. For a clot, for example, there's a life-saving clot buster that can save life and save brain during the golden hour, or golden hours, the 1 to 3 or 4 hours where time is brain, and you can save the life if you can treat it quickly. However, that same clot buster will kill you instantly if it's a rupture. So it's critically important to know what you're dealing with. And with modern medicine, we can do miracles, but when it's not available to us, it can lead to very adverse outcomes. So if 4.4 minutes can lead to a loss of life for heart attacks, and 4.4 minutes may very well be the difference between loss of life for a stroke, time matters. Time is brain. And then the Internet of Everything has really manifested even worse during the pandemic. We saw smart, connected, cloud-backed technologies like cancer delivery machines, who, when they had a disruption on the back end, were unable to perform their clinical operational functions for protracted amounts of time, thanks to software flaws and software disruptions. So the Internet of Medical Things is more brittle than we fully expected. We can't always assume that they're going to be readily available. Now let's shift much more to the biology here, and a lot of the work that my team and I did during the pandemic. So you might recall this sober milestone of the country hitting 500,000 dead Americans about this time last year from COVID. But what was less covered is around the same time, CDC was tracking about 150,000 excess deaths from non-COVID conditions. These are time-sensitive things like heart, brain, pulmonary, and diabetes that, if not treated quickly, may result in excess deaths, or the difference between expected deaths and actual deaths for a given condition and geography and time of year. So while we were tracking the COVID impact, delayed integrated care was taking a larger impact than most understood. And my team tried to study that. These excess deaths, again, are above and beyond the normal expected deaths for a given time period. And we tried to use data science to figure out why. Now, remember, if 4.4 minutes can be the difference between life and death for a heart attack, and 4 hours the difference between life and death for a stroke, what could 4 weeks of being out for the largest healthcare network in Vermont do to patient safety and human life? Very harrowing and very protracted downtime for at least this victim, followed by others throughout the year, including San Diego and other parts of the country. So when we look at modern healthcare delivery, it's not just the statistical proof of loss of life or harm that could be done, and we'll get to that in a minute, but it's also the acute cases. The Wall Street Journal put out a piece on the front page about a lost life of an infant shortly after a ransom attack had hit a hospital. The lawsuit alleges that the systems were affected sufficiently to affect the patient care outcome. And a woman gave birth to a baby under these less optimal conditions, and while survived childbirth, eventually perished. And the family sued, in part because of exchanges between doctors and staff about how that had they had proper imaging available to them, they would not have treated the baby this way. So we may have this settle out of court, and this is a pending case, but essentially this is alleged to be the first specific victim of a ransomware attack. and if this settles, may create case law of new and evolving responsibilities, or at least a settlement. So when we look at these modern healthcare delivery, it's easy to forget how many pieces of technology surround these patients. But we shouldn't be distracted by that as well. What should be at the center of every choice we make in the design and the delivery of care is the patient at the center of it all. So my team back at CISA, we studied to look at those excess deaths and found some troubling things. We wanted to get leading indicators and warn the public and warn hospital and public health officials on how to make better decisions. So one of the things we ultimately published in November was that we could see strong positive correlation between ICU bed utilization rates and ICU excess deaths 2, 4, and 6 weeks later. So to put a little graph there, we did it twice. Once was February to March for the first year of the pandemic, and then again was July to July. And what it showed is while 75% use of an intensive care unit is often ideal pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, it's quite fatal, and it gets worse the further over 75% you get. And at many points during this pandemic, we've been well north of 75% and at times north of 100%. And just to put some numbers on these, if the country hit 75%, countrywide at the same time, you would see 12,000 excess deaths 2 weeks later. If you got to 100%, you would see 80,000 excess deaths 2 weeks later, with another tranche 4 and 6 weeks later. So we're talking very large numbers. And what might stun you is that these are not older folks with comorbidities. These are 25 to 40. These are the highest or fastest growing demographic was age 25 to 44-year-olds, younger people suffering from degrade and delayed care. So we ultimately, on October 1st, published a much larger one, which included not just the measurement of hospital strain as measured in ICU and excess deaths, but we also looked at some of the system dynamics and how, armed with this new measurement, we could statistically point to a loss of life from cyber attacks. So a couple of graphics you could read at your leisure, but essentially during conventional care, if there's an outage from a ransom or a power outage or an active shooter situation, you would merely divert to next nearest facility in an urban area. But during the pandemic, when everyone was strained, a failure anywhere had a cascading effect everywhere very quickly. When we first wrote this in spring of 2021 and December of the prior year, we meant at the city level. By the time we published this in October, we are now describing it at the state level, where states like Texas or Idaho not only would have a complete failover having to ship patients to faraway states, but they started to dramatically strain their neighboring states who could not absorb the capacity. Remember, I said that these are not just elderly people. Some of the largest categories here are the time-sensitive ones, like heart, like brain, like pulmonary, where those 4.4 minutes or 4 hours could be the difference between if you're walk again or talk again, if you're breathing. And those demographics, again, where the percent increase was the highest in 25 to 44-year-olds, which has an uncomfortable overlap with critical infrastructure workforce across the water we drink, the food we put on our table, the people who provide our medical supplies, our longshoremen, our first responders, and firemen who need to come put out the fire in case of emergency. We can't afford to lose them to sickness, death, burnout, injury, and alterations in their family structure. We then studied hospital networks and states hit hardest by ransomware. And these outages, which can be protracted and significant, could affect radiology and our inability to see what kind of stroke it is, could affect electronic records. You can't get chemotherapy cocktails out without starting from scratch with brand new admissions, maybe several states away from your home. And you couldn't get emergency services to function or laboratory tests in a timely manner, where time is brain, time is life. And we could see that even though the initial hard down and loss of availability could be recovered from partially within 7 days and maybe even 60, 70% within 21 days, it didn't really fully restore most things back to, quote, normal for a protracted amount of time. And observing some of these states hit hardest across a statistically significant observation period of 5 months in the same state with the same population during the same pandemic, adjusting for hospital type and hospital size, we could see that hospitals hit by a ransom both achieved these dangerous stress zones of ICU and excess deaths sooner and stayed there longer than their peer groups. So what we can model here is that initial cyber disruption in column 1 can lead to ambulance diversion and add significant transit delays for the timely administration of care, which could lead to loss of life in the acute sense, hence those concentric rings of 4.4 minutes or a few hours. And then ultimately, when they do get their destination, if they are putting ICU strain above 75%, they are dramatically increasing the excess deaths 2, 4, and 6 weeks later at the national level, state level. And ultimately, that's the aggregate of those local overflows as described before. So what does the road ahead look like for things like what this means for our overdependence on undependable things? A whole lot of things. But one thing that's going to be useful to this crowd at this conference is that really stunning and bold list of President Biden's executive order improving cybersecurity. Had lots of things in it, but one near and dear to my heart. I'm going to read a line in here. In the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is, and to the consequences we will incur if that trust is misplaced. Transparency is coming, folks. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, S-bomb is coming. S-bomb is arguably here. And if you don't think that the White House is enough of a motivating force, when John Oliver is talking about ransom as a bit, it's hit the zeitgeist and the consciousness, whether it's these number of hospitals hit in 2020, whether it's the examples in Vermont, whether it's our original task force and CyberMeds summit, talking about 85% don't have a single security person on staff. It actually got worse in many places during the pandemic. So when I look at what's coming, we should look at the first 6 waves. Just squint here, and these are the hospitalization rates. Here's the COVID case rates, which is much higher since I even took a snapshot of this slide. These are the types of hospitalizations. What we really care about is net ICU. So whether you care about COVID or not, whether you care about Omicron or not, whether you think you've already had it, net ICU strain leads to the loss of life for you, your family, or the people you care about. You want timely appendectomy, a timely treatment for your car accident, a timely visit for your gallbladder surgery. And this net ICU is the constraint for the country right now, because with each of these waves of the pandemic, right, spring to larger summer to larger winter, they're getting worse year over year. And now in our 6th wave of the pandemic, our most deadly yet, each of these waves is further eroding our strategic workforce and our citizens, and more importantly, the critical infrastructure workforce that supplies the water, the food, the oil and gas, the schools, et cetera. So when we had studied those first 3 waves, we had lost 150,000 people, but that was with full complement of nurses and doctors. With each wave, as they retire, as they succumb to sickness, death, burnout, injury, we're having fewer workers with which to do more work. And in the time from when we first studied it through when we finally published it, another 90,000 Americans died from excess deaths. And this winter flu season easily could add another 200,000 to 300,000 more to those ranks. It all depends on how much concurrent strain we put on those ICUs. So as each of these waves further washes over our medical workforce, it is having increasing impact on our critical infrastructure and our ability to function as a country. And these critical infrastructure sectors need to focus on being able to anticipate and handle failure. We need to be able to be better and faster so that none of those hospital disruptions for a day, a week, or a month are due to elective attack surface or not knowing where our exposures might be because we are blind to the software transparency and pedigree. So I'm a huge fan of S-bomb. I'm the progenitor of S-bomb in public policy. You're going to see a lot of S-bomb content in the next couple of days. This is not something we should do eventually. This is not something we should do in a phased approach. This is long overdue. This is the kind of thing that we are going to look back and say, why didn't we do this sooner? So we're all in a supply chain. Most of us are in the middle. And even though several medical devices went to quickly check if they had Log4j, They quickly determine they did or didn't, but what they forget is those third-party compound parts, those remote access technologies, those industrial IoT connectivity maintenance tools also have log4j, and so do their components. And if it's remotely exploitable or remotely reachable, it's not your fault. It's still your problem. And this is really proving to the world why we need better transparency, not one hop, not two hops, but a full look at the dependence we have on exploitable technology. So others will walk you through these, but I've been shepherding this along with the NTA, now CISA, SBOM, working groups for years now. It's here. It's time to step up and stop making excuses. Now, what we're seeing through this overdependence on undependable things is our best practices aren't anymore good enough from the past, isn't anymore if it ever was. And it's going to take courage to fight through this. There was a time where we didn't wash our hands before surgery. A doctor would go straight from the morgue to delivering a baby, and we had very high mortality rates for mothers and for babies later. Semmelweis said we should probably wash our hands. It took about 100 years for people to listen. People just figured, yep, you win some, you lose some. There's just certain death rates. It's as good as it gets. We're doing the best we can. But 100 years later, he's now the patron saint of mothers and motherhood and childbirth. And we wouldn't think of doing surgery without scrubbing in first. Similarly, the mortality rate for childhood leukemia used to be a death sentence. And now it's an incredibly survivable thing, in part because this guy was stubborn and tenacious and a pain in the butt and wouldn't let it happen. Did bone marrow sampling, which called him a butcher, had to come up with cocktails for chemotherapy, not one thing, but several, and get very aggressive, which is how we do all cancer treatment now. Had to do platelet transfers. This guy innovated so many different things by being stubborn and tenacious and saying good enough isn't. And I need that kind of attitude from this group on our overdependence on undependable software, because stuff's on fire, folks. Again, through that overdependence on undependable software, we have created the conditions such that any accidents and adversaries can have a profound effect on human life. The life you save may be your own or those of those you care about. So if this rings true for you, whether you do this through your work, your day job, your volunteerism through OWASP, or you want to throw in with I Am the Cavalry to be part of the solution. Every one of us is a father, a mother, a son, a neighbor, an uncle, an aunt. It's going to take the best of each of you to step up and find significant ways to advance the trustworthiness of our digital infrastructure, the transparency of the supply chains that feed them. And as the country and the world is increasingly depending on digital infrastructure, they are increasingly depending on you. I can't wait to see what you're going to do to rise to meet that challenge.